Good morning, everybody. My name is Rich Sloma. Welcome to today's New York State Archives presentation of creating file plans for electronic records. Today's presenter is Maria McCashin. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the chat box to the lower left side of your screen, and we will answer them at the end of this presentation. If anyone is encountering one of the problems in the chat box, it's very difficult for me to see what you write. For some reason, the print shows up, the font shows up as very small, and it can't be adjusted. So just bear with me as you type in your comments. I'll have to copy them and paste them into a document. At this point, I will go ahead and turn it over to Maria.
Thank you, Rich. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Creating File Plans for Electronic Records. And I'm just going to forward this slide. Forgot how to do it. Sorry, everyone. I hope you're all enjoying the summer. This is the 5th in our series of 7 one-hour web records management webinars. The webinar series was developed to cover key records management principles and practices, and topics have included implementing a modern files management system, developing, renewing, or reviving a successful records management program, and establishing records management policies and procedures, and conducting an electronic records inventory. The last 2 webinars in this series will be held Wednesday, July 22nd. That's Introduction to Historical Records for Records Managers, presented by Central New York Regional Advisory Officer Kent Stutz. And Wednesday, August 5th, Your Role as Records Management Officer, presented by Metro Long Island Regional Advisory Officer Lorraine Hill. And you can register for the next webinars on our website. As you can see it on the screen, www.archives.nysed.gov. If you've missed any of the live presentations, all of the webinars will be recorded and you can revisit them at your convenience. If you haven't been to our website recently, we have a new web design. It's the same address, new design. You can link to workshops at the top of the home page, and there you can register for a webinar or you can listen to a recorded webinar. So you know, many of the images in this presentation are from digital collections that are maintained by the State Archives. I included them because we have thousands of great images, which you can browse in the digital collections on the Archives website. And I included them because their creation relates to our discussion. In order to create these images and make them accessible and easy to use by staff and the public, a plan had to be developed to name and organize the files in a meaningful way. And one of the ways the Archives did this was by developing procedures for creating consistent file names. The Archives developed a plan for file names based on information that was understood by staff that allowed them to match the image to the location of its original. And you can see an example of one of the file names on this slide under the image of the Washington statue and Sub-Treasury building in New York City. So sit back and relax for an hour. Enjoy the images. Hopefully they'll help conjure up some amazing ideas for file plans or inspire you to implement some of the strategies we'll cover today. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation, as Rich mentioned. Type your questions in and Rich will read them for us. I also encourage you to contact your Regional Advisory Officer, or RAO, if you're developing file plans and would like to discuss your project in more detail. Contact information for RAOs can be found by clicking on Contact at the bottom of our home page and then clicking on Local Government Regional Advisory Officers. Each officer advises specific regions in the state. And again, we apologize for any technical difficulties that you may have during the presentation. If you do run into trouble, we are recording the webinar for future viewing. And prior to the workshop, you were sent a handout. Sorry for the huge file sent first initially. The handout contains the slides, the webinar slides, and if you'd like to take notes throughout the presentation, you can use the handout. So today we're going to focus on some key elements to consider when creating file plans for unstructured electronic records. And we'll start by defining unstructured electronic records. We'll talk about some of the challenges they create, including associated legal issues, and discuss why filing plans are essential for managing them. We're going to talk about filtering out the records, which may only be a small percentage of what you create or receive, and the rest may be non-record material. Records and non-records need to be managed. In this webinar, we're going to focus on creating filing plans for the records. We'll outline some management strategies, including incorporating retention and disposition into filing plans for electronic records. And then finally, it wouldn't be records management without discussing policies and procedures to help maintain your filing plans. Unstructured electronic records are those that are usually kept in network folders or folders stored on your laptop or your desktop PC, and they might be word processed documents, PDFs, emails and attachments, or they might be paper records that you've scanned for easier access. The majority of these files usually aren't records. They might be works in progress, reference material, duplicates, or copies of the official records when the official copy is printed onto paper and signed, and the electronic copy is retained for convenience and easy access. In this case, the electronic copy can be disposed of when it's no longer needed because it's a duplicate, or kept as long as the official copy, and then both should be disposed of at the same time or retained permanently. Unstructured records can be difficult to manage, and one reason is that they're usually named and arranged by their creator or an individual creator, and each creator's plan for naming and arranging may not necessarily be understood by anyone else. While it might make perfect sense to the creator, a nondescript file name such as a letter to ABC Company or January report filed in folders named Joe's Files or Projects probably won't make sense to others. And the files may become inaccessible if the creator leaves the organization. If that happens, each file may have to be opened and read to know its contents or determine whether or not it's a record. This may not be necessary if the person never created or received records, but if the creator was town supervisor or another official, the result could be a very time-consuming project for someone. If you're in a situation where you need access to files created by many individuals, as on a shared drive in a local area network, finding and retrieving them can be very time-consuming or impossible if there's no consistent filing plan. Also, when you scan paper records to improve their access, you're creating unstructured records if you're not using a database to manage them. Prior to scanning, a plan should be developed to name the files consistently and set up an arrangement that's easy to use. Without a plan, you can waste a tremendous amount of time and resources scanning images that no one can access. Some additional challenges associated with unstructured electronic records relate to accessibility. Greater accessibility can be a good thing and potentially a bad thing. Unstructured records stored locally on a shared drive may be accessible to multiple people, which can be a good thing. But if not everyone with access should be allowed to see or copy certain files, there could be potential security concerns. If you're giving the public access to records on your website, are they the same files as your official version of the records, or are they slightly different? For example, do they all have signatures when they're posted on your website? Or do you have multiple versions of the same record? Challenges related to trustworthiness. What processes do you have in place to manage the revision of documents to ensure that everyone's viewing the latest version? And do your electronic records facilitate legal compliance? For example, do you have quick access to any record needed to comply with any related federal or state regulation? Challenges related to preservation. By law, you must ensure that access to electronic records you must ensure access to electronic records for their full retention period. And you should be able to identify permanent electronic records in order to monitor them so that they can be migrated to new formats and that the hardware and software can be updated before the records become inaccessible. These steps need to be taken in order to maintain functionality and to allow records to be easily manipulated, queried, analyzed, and linked over the long term. Your filing plans should also identify short-term electronic records so that they can be disposed of once they've met retention requirements and not kept forever. So here are some goals to keep in mind when you're creating and organizing your electronic records. Your file plan should allow your records to be retrieved easily, just like a good paper filing system where you know exactly what drawer to open and which folder contains what you're looking for. Written guidelines for folder and file name creation will enable you and other staff to apply consistent names, which will allow records to be identified consistently. If you already have successful naming conventions for your paper records, you can use those to develop conventions for your electronic records. In many cases, your electronic records either replace or duplicate your paper records, and it probably makes sense to use the same names to avoid confusion. The filing plan should allow for easy identification of record types by their folder or their file names, and include dates to identify permanent records and those that have met their retention requirements and can be disposed of. A good filing plan will allow you to make records available quickly if they're requested, for example, under the Freedom of Information Law, or for an audit, or for other legal review. And if a record can't be made available because it's met its retention requirements and has been disposed of, a good file plan will provide evidence to that effect. And then, of course, you want a plan that will make everyone's job easier. So in order to identify the unstructured records and manage them, you really should start with an inventory of all your electronic records. The inventory is going to tell you what records you have, where they're stored, who's the official owner of the electronic records, and for example, who created them or who maintains them, and who manages the records and how they're managed. Now, the State Archives has a separate 3-hour workshop and a 1-hour recorded webinar available on inventorying your electronic records. So if you want more information on how to conduct one, you may want to look into that. An inventory can also help determine the official record, and that's the one that must be retained for its full retention period. So you do want to determine the official record and, for example, decide if it's the paper printout or the electronic file that's stored on the server. It often happens, as I mentioned before, that the official record is the paper copy and the electronic file that created it is also kept for easy access. But in this case, both need to be managed. When you first create or receive an item, that's usually the best time to determine whether or not it's a record or a non-record. And a non-record may be, again, a work in progress or reference material or a duplicate. Filtering out the records from the non-records and storing them in separate locations is a good initial step towards getting your filing plan underway. Your filing plan will need structure. And to begin developing a filing structure, one of the things you can do is identify the main functions of your government. And you can use that to develop structure. For electronic files, where you want to have information shared between departments that share a function, a functional arrangement might be useful. An example of a function would be an administrative function or a fiscal function. The State Archives retention and disposition schedules are divided by functional headings, and using your retention schedule can be a useful tool for setting up structure based on function. Using functions can also be useful because while organizational structures change, their functions rarely do. But you could also base structure on departments, especially if the files are maintained by individual departments. When you develop the structure, you want to think of broad categories and work your way down to activities and transactions. And then finally to the record series level, which would be the lowest level. It's helpful to create a minimum number of levels, and there's no rule about the levels you create, although generally no more than 3 is recommended. The structures should balance the need for quick filing and retrieval. And usually quick filing and retrieval is done better with fewer levels and larger categories. But then you want to balance this with business needs for accurate and easy retention and disposition, which is usually done by adding more levels. So you want to try to create a balance between the two or determine which you need more. Within the structure is the file arrangement, which is the predetermined order of the files in a record series. And this is the core element of the filing system since it provides the structure for your files within the record series. An arrangement may already be there, or it may be easily imposed, as with numbered records such as vouchers or files with case numbers. If you need to set up an arrangement, one way to determine the arrangement is to determine how the records are requested. Are they requested by subject, by name associated with the record, by a specific title, by a case file number, or an identification number? Knowing types of arrangements and their advantages and disadvantages can produce ideas on how to improve retrieval. But you don't want to rearrange the files if it's not really necessary. If they're already numbered, you really don't need to rearrange them. Some types of arrangements that you might consider are alphabetical, subject, numerical, or chronological. If you've developed a useful filing plan for paper records, you might adapt it for your electronic records. And in this view, this is the Town of Salina Master Filing Plan. It's an example of a functional arrangement set up hierarchically with no more than 3 levels of arrangements. So you've got the function, the series, and then a more specific subseries. A plan like this can be adapted to an electronic folder and file system. And the following slide shows how the bolded terms down on the bottom, land use, planning, and board minutes, could be adapted to set up electronic folders and files for these permanent records. So in this display, it looks like most PCs with segmented drives that allow for a choice where to store the records. The drives might include a hard drive or drives for removable media or drives for a local area network. The drive in this display is highlighted in red, and we used P for the drive name. The folders, which could be equivalent to paper folders, are highlighted in blue, and there are multiple folders in this example. The file name section appears in black with the .doc extension. The file name itself should be simple and as short as possible, and also easy to understand. We used minutes in this example and the date of the minutes. So we know the type of minutes by where they're filed under planning and board minutes, and the date is written to help auto-sort the files and also to make browsing them easy. In this next example, The filing plan can be adapted to set up electronic files and folders for general ledgers under the fiscal functional heading. So in this example, the filing has 2 levels, but it could be set up using 3, with finance at the top level, ledgers at the next level, and general at the 3rd level, which might be necessary if you maintain more than one type of fiscal ledger electronically. The retention period has been added to the 2nd level. So you see finance, general ledger, and then 6 years. That's a reminder that their retention period is 6 years. The dates included on the general ledger, in the general ledger file name, make it easy to identify the record for access and then also for disposition. So a master list like the Town of Salinas, once adopted for electronic filing, could become part of policies and procedures. And then included in these policies and procedures might be the requirement that anyone with authority to set up folders and files, or electronic folders and files, must use terms on the list. And that will be one way to maintain consistency in a filing plan. Another requirement might be that any changes or additions to the list must be approved by designated staff. Another strategy for managing electronic records involves the application of a method called big buckets to your filing and retention strategy. Big buckets was developed by the National Archives and Records Administration, and it was created to simplify retention by addressing records at a level higher than the individual record series. So in this example, it's at the functional level for fiscal records. And the items listed are from the ED1, that's the State Archives Retention and Disposition Schedule for schools. The bracketed numbers are the item numbers, relate to the item numbers in the ED1. If you're using this strategy, you can group records with the same or similar retention period in one folder. And the folder could even hold records with varied retention periods, maybe 1, 3, or 6-year records, as long as you don't mind keeping some records longer. In this case, a search engine, as in Windows Explorer, would be used for retrieval of the electronic records within the folder, and then the file plan is set up to manage retention and disposition electronically. The big bucket retention can also be programmed into a software system to manage retention similarly. And then, like many solutions, it has its advantages and disadvantages. Some pros of big buckets would be the simplification on the end of the user, because it reduces the number of choices individuals have to make when they're filing and assigning retention to electronic records that they create individually. It simplifies system requirements because it reduces the number of retentions an electronic system must be programmed to handle. And it improves consistency because there are less choices, therefore there's a lower margin of error or variation. Some negatives of big buckets is that it leads to increase in retention periods. For example, if you wanted to use the big bucket strategy to retain all non-permanent emails for 6 years, you might be lengthening the retention for some emails from 1 to 5 years. It's also a concept that appears to be anti-records management because it seems to discard a core principle, which is that records should be managed in a record series. However, it can help ensure against retention being all or nothing. So saving everything forever or destroying everything after an arbitrary period of time. And it still requires knowledge of retention periods for electronic series to implement buckets of an appropriate size. So that said, it's essential for records managers to be involved in planning and designing a solution that ensures legal compliance. Another option for filing your unstructured electronic records is an Electronic Content Management System, or ECMS. An ECMS serves as a central platform for managing content. Depending upon your specific circumstances, an ECMS can offer many benefits for a filing plan. It provides faster access to documents. It can allow you to view documents from your PC. It can allow for cross-referencing. You could pull up all the invoices from a particular vendor for a particular year, for example. It reduces paper volume because you can store an entire file cabinet in the space of a single CD. It acts as a central repository for records of all formats. And this can prevent the need to search multiple file cabinets across network folders and individual desktops to find what you need. An ECMS can also help you address compliance requirements. The system can ensure that records are retained for an entire retention period. It can help ensure security of the records and ensure authenticity. So to ensure that you're storing only the original copy that hasn't been altered or changed. And it can improve your work process by improving collaboration and streamlining workflows. There are a lot of considerations before purchasing an ECMS, and individual situations will determine if any of these potential benefits are applicable. If your records have a high retrieval rate, then an ECMS could greatly improve access. An ECMS can add high value to your documents, which means that digital records can be more easily backed up and stored off-site than paper. And the records stored in the ECMS can act as a second copy for permanent records. If you require multiple user access, an ECMS can provide this. If you need to share documents, again, they can be easily shared and transported. And if you need to improve work process, an ECMS can incorporate workflow into your filing plan. Also, if storage space shortage is a concern, an ECMS can help alleviate this. But there are definitely reasons when implementing an ECMS may not make the most sense. If you don't have many documents to store electronically, then it's probably cost prohibitive. If you have a high volume of records that are stored, but you never retrieve them, then it's probably best to keep them in their existing format. If there's a low value to your documents and losing them won't cause undue harm to your local government or the public or any other governing body, then you may want to think twice about an ECMS and if it's worth the effort to implement. If you have no one to support the system and its administration, again, probably not worth the effort because the system requires resources and support to maintain it. Some other things you need to consider when you're thinking about an ECMS is the total cost of ownership. There's maintenance involved, support, and training necessary. Also, what departments in your organization can actually use the system. And then if you were to be considering an ECMS to scan paper records, you want to determine which records you would want to scan into the system. The Archives also has a 3-hour workshop related to ECMS if you'd like to learn about these systems in more detail. Next, I'm going to show you some examples of filing plans that are set up in 2 different ECMS. And the following screenshots were contributed by RMOs who are currently using ECMS to manage some of their scanned records. And keep in mind, you still need to develop filing plans in order to use these systems to manage your electronic records. So this slide and the next 3 views are of building records in an ECMS. This is a screenshot of records pertaining to land parcels. It shows a master file that's been opened and contains individual folders for every parcel in a town. Now, it's essential that you create meaningful file plans for your electronic records, whether you're setting them up manually on a shared network or using an ECMS. And this screenshot represents the progressive steps to filing in a consistent manner. The plan should be set up to be easy to understand and to use. One way to do this, as we've mentioned, is to mirror it against a paper filing system. These records have been scanned into the system, the records in this example, and there's some programming involved. You have to determine your filing plan, and once you've done that, the system can be set up consistently to name the files, file them, apply retention and disposition, and then notify someone when the records are ready for disposition. This screenshot is intended to show you some of the potential benefits and also the versatility of using electronic records management. So not everyone has the budget for an ECMS, but this model could be manually applied to a shared network. And then using written policies and procedures or written guidelines, you can maintain it consistently. This screenshot shows an individual building parcel folder with departmental subfolders related to land use transactions. So there's building, the assessor, zoning, highway, planning board, town board, etc. This screenshot shows building department folders related to parcel activities. So things like permits, inspections, and violations. This screenshot shows documents within a building department permit subfolder, and it includes permits through the years for various improvements and modifications. An example of varied retention is in the building department permit folder, where there's a subfolder for liability insurance, which has a 6-year retention period after expiration. Other folders in this particular display have documents with permanent retention or 6 years after a building no longer exists. So the system allows you to scan documents directly into a folder specific to liability insurance, so the liability insurance subfolder. And then using the records management module, you can assign retention through a workflow. And then the system can be assigned the date and expiration and the retention time of that specific document. And ECMS has built-in capabilities for managing records, and it comes with basic workflow or a basic infrastructure that will improve records access and searchability. If your organization needs more complex capabilities to assign, name, direct, search for, and retain electronic records, a more complex infrastructure has to be programmed into the ECMS. So the time and expense and expertise necessary to do additional programming should be considered and also discussed with a vendor before you purchase an ECMS. This screenshot shows an electronic management folder structure for contracts. Unlike some records which can be assigned a specific date for disposition, the disposition of contracts is event-based, meaning that an event such as the contract expiring or terminating or being denied or the receipt of a final payment under contract occurs first, and then the retention period of 6 years is applied. On the next slide, I'm going to show you the properties for denied contracts. And this view shows the programming associated with time and event-based cutoff. So in this example, the system's programmed to store denied contracts for the first 3 years within the system, so they're accessible, and then move them to an off-site storage location for the remaining 3 years, which may require extra steps to retrieve them if necessary. It's kind of like inactive storage. The next group of screenshots were contributed by Sheila Amond, the Information Processing Manager for Orange Ulster BOCES. These show an ECMS set up to maintain school records, and in these examples, paper records have been scanned into the system. This screenshot is a file cabinet set up for a school district, and any field can be modified, added, or deleted by the system administrator. This view demonstrates a field called doc type, which is based on record series. The field can be programmed so that only an assigned user with the appropriate rights can see the series assigned to them. Excuse me. In this example, the arrow points to the doc type or the record series payroll. And if you clicked on payroll, then you could select a specific payroll report or contents of that specific payroll record series, as shown in the second grouping. The retention would be indicated in the retention field with a start and an end date. You can click on retention. You can see it on the left-hand side to apply your retention or to see your retention for a specific report within payroll. The end date in this particular case is monitored for deletions monthly. So the BOCES practice is to alert the district contact person, usually the RMO, for permission to destroy items that have reached their retention according to the ED1, which again is the State Archives retention and disposition schedule for school districts. And then after this is done, the action is documented. In this view, the doc type or the record series example, the field name might be transcripts, but this particular school in this example didn't separate the transcripts, and they had files back to the early 1900s, and it was agreed upon that the doc type or the record series be the same as the physical records that were stored. For other transcripts and student files that are scanned in, each person is populated or indexed by the doc type, which might be named transcript or student file, and then the student's last name, their first name, middle name, date of birth, graduation year, and student ID. So that's just an example of some of the indexing involved. In this example, the system was set up for older student record cards. The system was populated with each letter of the alphabet representing surnames. One record card could contain 30 to 100 pages, and many were handwritten and lacking date of birth. With these older scanned records, it would be necessary for someone to browse the alphabetical grouping to find an individual student record card. Now, alphabetical groupings may have been used in this case because maybe optical character recognition, or OCR, couldn't be applied to improve searchability because the records were handwritten, and or they weren't indexed by specific names because they aren't retrieved often enough to warrant the time and expense for the additional indexing. In this last example, these are LPN student files, and the contents of those files, which is represented by reports, have varying retention. So each set of quote-unquote reports can be assigned individual retention. A system with these capabilities might be one to consider if you're maintaining electronic case files that contain records with varied retention. Some advice from Sheila Amond for using ECMS to manage scanned records. You can manage paper records electronically, but if the plan is poor, the result will be as poor. Plan the project with expectation of access 20 years from now, whether you're going to be there or not. Use policy and best practices to create the plan. Naming convention must be consistent. This is vital. Jury or review the database for consistency. This is vital. And use naming conventions that the district staff will understand. Some advice regarding setting up file plans in an ECMS from Maureen Reynolds, Tompkins County Clerk and one of the driving forces behind setting up Tompkins County and its towns and villages with ECMS. Keep it simple and don't overthink the process. And if it doesn't work, so what? We can always try again. I try to mimic the folder structure of a user's desktop or paper files. The end user will be more likely to buy into the process when I make them as comfortable as possible. You need to have policies and procedures to maintain all components of your records management program. And if you want to integrate a filing plan into your overall records management program, one thing you'll need is to get executive and board support for developing the policies and procedures. This is essential. You need them to support the time necessary to develop the policies and procedures and to implement them. Without their support to enforce the policies and procedures, it's going to be difficult to get everyone on board. And not having support for policies or management backing to enforce the policies is pretty much the same as not having any policies. Getting input from your IT director or technical support provider can also be beneficial, especially if you lean towards the non-technical. Their perspective may provide additional insight, and they might even provide you with ideas for automating steps when you're developing a filing plan, or provide you with necessary technical insight if you're considering an ECMS. You also need IT to be aware of long-term and permanent electronic records so that they can be monitored and maintained permanently. Policy and procedures can help maintain consistency in your program. You can use them as training tools. They can help you resolve questions quickly. You've got a documented answer, for example, when answering how long a particular record is retained and how it should be disposed of. A policy and procedure manual can also protect you should any aspect of your electronic filing practices be questioned or you're asked to explain how you file your electronic records. You've got written documentation to back you up. A file plan manual or guidelines could also be part of your policies and procedures, and it should be made available to anyone responsible for electronic file creation. It's one way to allow current staff and your successors to continue a plan developed for consistently naming and arranging electronic files. Written documentation of the design of the filing plan and policies regarding its maintenance might include roles and responsibilities. For example, who has the authority to create, name, alter, and delete documents from any electronic system. Standardized naming conventions for documents and electronic folders. Criteria and practices for managing inactive records and for disposing of obsolete records. Security and physical preservation of electronic records such as passwords and also things like backup procedures. And then training for all staff on the policies and procedures regarding creation, maintenance, access, security, retention, and legal disposition of electronic records. Here are some words of wisdom on policies and procedures relating to ECMS from Katie Palmer House, town clerk for the town of Dover, and an organizer of the Hudson Valley Laserfish Municipal Users Group. Our security policy, along with our employee computer use policy, has really helped us justify how we implemented the process for staff and the public in a consistent and meaningful way. Currently, we don't assign rights to users. We assign rights to groups based on their need to use the ECMS. So the public and some staff have limited access and read-only, and some clerks have additional scanning rights, and a few have the right to fix data with the use of a recycle bin, and only administrators have full access with delete rights. We also have an updated 2012 records management law in our town code that begins to address electronic records and outlines how the Records Advisory Board can support the RMO, which was pretty much absent before. There are many benefits of a well-designed electronic records filing plan. A good plan can improve staff efficiency. It can reduce the time spent searching for records. The process of organizing them alone will reduce clutter and make it easier to find what you need. A good plan facilitates the sharing of information with the development of consistent naming conventions for folders and files that's easy to understand and to apply to electronic records in a shared system. Implementing a plan will reduce redundant copies, which will consume less storage space and also make backing up electronic records easier. A filing plan supports business continuity because it identifies essential electronic records and identifies them for extra protection. It also reduces risk and compliance costs by enabling staff to easily retrieve electronic records in order to demonstrate compliance for any governing bodies, thus reducing potential fines and other penalties associated with non-compliance. So what could be better than that? Okay, we are at the end of this webinar. Thank you very much for participating today. And don't miss the next webinar, which is Wednesday, July 22nd, Introduction to Historical Records for Records Managers. We've got some time for questions, so if you have any questions at this point, feel free to type them in, and Rich will read them to us.
As I had mentioned earlier, I don't know if everybody else is experiencing the same problem, but the font, the type in the chat box has become very small. It's some sort of problem with the software apparently. But if you type your question in there, I can copy and paste it, and I'll be able to see it. Also, if you have the opportunity before you log off for the session, just let us know if there were more than one person at your location watching the presentation, just so we can get a good count. If you had multiple locations with multiple viewers, but if you only had one person, we'll just count you, and we'll be fine with that. And as Maria mentioned, we were recording this, so this will be available on Blackboard and then later YouTube to be viewed again. I don't see any questions.
Well, if questions do come up later on, feel free to email us at any time. And we do have lengthier in-person workshops related to ECMS, inventorying electronic records, managing electronic records. We have a new one related to managing your email. You can look for those on the workshop page on our website if you are interested in attending any of those.
I also want to let folks know that we'll be sending a survey out to get your input on what you thought we did well and and how we can improve our presentations. And as I mentioned, we will be going to WebEx as of the August 5 webinar, Your Roles as a Records Management Officer. So in August, we will have a new format. It's pretty much the same as Blackboard. It's just a little easier to use, and it won't have the issues that we're experiencing with Blackboard. And it is supported by the New York State Office for Information Technology. So, and don't see any questions at this point.
Well, I guess we'll end a little early then. Thank you all for attending, and I hope you enjoy your summer. And feel free to email me with any questions at any time.